So now, what better way than to start the session already? For that, please allow me to invite our two speakers, Mr. Doug Corley, the co-founder and CEO of DHB Global. Please give him the biggest round of applause. Thank you. And I'd also like to invite on stage Mr. Robert van der Cloud, the head of finance of Middle East and Africa of Munich. Please give him the biggest round of applause. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, together, Doug and Robert will be talking about the innovation as well as the future of healthcare. But first, I'm going to allow Doug to take over the stage. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me all right? Okay, so hope everybody had a nice lunch. Hope you didn't eat too much because you're going to be sitting down now for a while. So before I begin, I want to just tell you a little bit about who I am before I pontificate on the future. I'm from, officially, if you check the manual, I'm from China. But as you can tell by my background, perhaps I'm not. I actually moved to China 8 years ago and started to work in a big government research facility. Those jobs are gone now. I was the last kind of the American cohort who was able to work in translational research, which is fancy tech terms for early stage ideas that turn into drugs that then make their way into the market. And so why am I telling you a little bit about the past? Because so much of what I learned about how drug development happens, what's going really well, what's not going very well in emerging economies, healthcare systems across the world, is what we're going to see as the underlying theme here. So this says blockchain, the future of biotech. And yes, if you didn't think you'd get another blockchain talk, you were wrong. Here's one more. Why blockchain? So first and foremost, most people, when they think of biotechnology, they think of people in white lab coats giving lectures, drawing biosynthetic pathways. It's not the case anymore. Yes, you still need to have the hard science, period. But that's not enough at this point. Where a lot of R&D is heading and where China is kind of in an interesting leading position is the use of data. And so people have talked already a little bit about the use of data. Really, it's about digitizing it and being able to identify many things through that data. So I'll get a little bit more in-depth into it, but here are the high-level considerations. So in the top left, we have what's called the genome. By show of hands here, who knows generally what a genome is or what it represents? One person, okay. Two, okay. So a genome is essentially your body's blueprint. It tells you how you became you. The next is what's called the phenome, which is a fancy way of saying the phenotypic or the physical expression of that genome, right? So nature versus nurture, how do you become who you actually are? The third is the metabolome, and everybody can recognize the word metabolism within this, and that's essentially what it is. This is the breakdown of all of the data inside of what can be found either in your blood or in your stool. And this gives researchers huge amounts of data. Is this drug doing what we think it's supposed to be doing? Is it safe? Are there things in your blood or in your stool that should not be there that tells us it's actually having a deleterious effect? Okay? Transcriptome, this is a fancy term for all of the proteins in your body that ultimately take genetic information and turn it into actionable processes, active processes within your body. And this, again, tells researchers if what they're targeting is actually doing and creating the downward effect that they think it should be creating. And the very last one here in the bottom right is what's called the microbiome, which is literally just your gut. So it's been proven only maybe for the last 10 to 20 years. For the longest time, we thought that the genome was the biggest, most complicated thing in your body. It's not the case. Actually, the microbiome has, I think it's 2.5 times as much data inside of it as your genome. And so researchers are only now starting to understand the interaction between your guts and your health. And so this is where it gets very interesting. It gets very philosophical because on the one hand, science gets very technical and you need a lot of data to prove that. In another hand, a lot of traditional medicines have always gone back to your gut needs to have this certain balance, right? And so how many people here have been told by their doctor or a family member, hey, if your stomach's bothering you, have some yogurt, right? That's it. Yeah, more hands there. There we go. More than the genome. Okay. That's exactly what the consideration is. Unfortunately, when you eat live bacteria, it gets destroyed by everything before it gets into your gut. But the idea is right. This is a very complicated photo. It's what was called the Pioneer 100 study, which was the first time in the history of biotechnology that a group was able to take your metabolites, your blood results, your lifestyle measurements, like how many steps you take, what kind of food you're eating, and then also figure out what's living in your gut, what your parents have, so your genetic traits, as well as all of the proteins that are encoded within your proteome, and start to figure out what you look like as an individual. And this is the first metadata study that allowed the ISB group in Seattle to start to figure out how is it that we can be really, really predictive with the treatments that we give. And if you think about it, as I said, this is all about data. Every single bit and byte of data here tells you something about your health. So how many people here have a smartphone or a Fitbit or something like this that collects data? So here's a really, really useful thing to realize. At the end of 2018, the US FDA approved 12 what they call digiceuticals, or AI algorithms, that are going to be covered by public insurance to treat patients. And all it does is it takes this sort of data and it makes a recommendation. So this is an emerging class of drugs, as we saw from the Dow group of pharmaceuticals. This is what's being called digiceuticals. So using digital data to be able to create digital therapeutics. And so this has already begun. Like I said, at the end of 2018, there were 12 that were approved. Now I think the number's closer to 30. So it's starting to speed up pretty quickly. This is the paradigm shift, really, that we're going through. And I was a nerd in college. I spent all my days in a laboratory. And so this is the fundamental shift that's starting to change those, because we're going from, what is the biology? How does your body work? We figure out what that new insight may look like, and we translate that into something that we can test into a biological outcome. We would then figure out, let's say diabetes. Let's say that 13% of the population, roughly, in Pakistan has diabetes. We need to figure out which insulin works best for which patients, right? So you understand generally the disease of diabetes, type 1, type 2. You need to then figure out, how do we find the right way to treat and to manage the disease, okay? So the question would be, which drug is right for this particular patient we're trying to treat? You would then do a clinical trial or a validation study to see. This may give you insights into what's written there, the new mechanisms, okay? What's starting to be done now is new translational discoveries. Translation here meaning insights from the laboratory all the way into a currently applicable product. So using something for a new indication. And this is where a lot of basic science and biotech IP comes from, is figuring out that, hey, this thing that we've been using for a long time can also have these other effects, so biosimilars or bioequivalents. And it generates massive amounts of new data, which, if you think back to this, there's nothing fundamentally different about all of this data. The big insight was the connections within each of them. So how is all of this data related to itself? Okay? And I did, like I said, lots of laboratory work. This is where it gets out of my realm of strong comfort, computation. So I paid a visit to, let's see, I've been in 5 countries in 4 weeks. So I've been in quite a few research laboratories. And 20 years ago, a research lab would just be a bunch of PhDs aliquoting and taking, PCR results and looking at just lab printouts. Anymore, it's usually 1 or 2 PIs, so big famous scientists, and then they have an army of people running computational models. So this computation is really becoming very big, and they're allowing this to, using this data, figure out what are some possible drugs for us to discover. So they can run all the way through the process and see where there are new connections or new insights. And then instead of going through the 2-year process of basic laboratory research, run a software in 1 day and come up with 50 potential new drugs. So this is really starting to change the delivery of healthcare. The big problem is that data security right now, at least in America and in China, doesn't exist. So I'll give you two very strong examples. The first is Stanford Medical School. A computer science professor had a brain aneurysm. He then had to get a shunt put into his brain because the fluid traveling in his brain was causing issues. So it's basic plumbing. You just fix the plumbing and then everything's fine. And then you have a device that can be controlled by the doctor to turn it on, turn it off, and to turn up how much fluid flows. Something really scary happens, though, when this professor who was in computer science got his laptop open and started looking at all of the devices that he could connect to on his floor after surgery. He found out that he could access not only his own brain shunts, he could control anyone else's on the floors. In basic English, he could have killed everyone on the floor and no one would have known it. No one would have known it was happening until it was too late. And this is at the best medical school in America, and it was very basic security that was just lacking. So a lighter-hearted question is, who's this guy? Does anyone recognize him? Say that again? Close. This is Christian Bale as Dick Cheney. This is Dick Cheney. So there was a very famous example of Dick Cheney with a similar issue. So he was very well known for having a pacemaker put in. And at least in the American politique circles, it was very interesting because they had to, my friend's father was the doctor who had to go and explain to him that that device that you wear in your heart, you have to turn it off when you travel overseas. You have to. Because just like the brain shunts, it's Bluetooth enabled, right? So anyone can figure out where it is and can turn it off. So it's shocking to me that data security and access to these sorts of things, even as of 5 years ago, is still very, very behind. This is why blockchain is so important. I'll be the first person in the room to say I love the concept of blockchain, but we need to make sure it's being used when it's required. And I think for data sovereignty, data privacy, and really data security, it's vital. I think it's an amazing solution. So by the numbers, the opportunities in healthcare are huge. 50% of all clinical trials in the world get delayed. 85% of the trials that fail for one reason. They didn't have enough patients. And 80% of trials are delayed for at least 1 month. And depending on the kind of trial that's being done, for 1 month, that can be anywhere from $500,000 to up to $20 million. It's very, very expensive. And the general the general solutions that are in the market today look like these. So using blockchain technology with biotechnology or applied healthcare, you can be able to actually eliminate a lot of the sovereignty with health records and be able to pool this together so that the patient owns their own healthcare data. And again, going back to my experience in China, every hospital in China has at least 17 departments inside of it. So what's called the Sanjia hospital. So think of it like an R1 institution in the world. What that means is that when you go from one hospital department to the next, you have to physically carry a little booklet and give it to the next doctor. And then if you need a third, another physical booklet. And this is really important because whether it's for inter-hospital transportation and portability of data, China does not have it. Many healthcare systems in the world don't have it. And even in parts of the US, this doesn't happen. The big push here has been for the patients to hold their data digitally themselves and have API plugins so that all of the hospital systems and all the hospital data structures can have access to this. And this has already been rolled out in the US by a company named Hashed Health, and it's been proven to eliminate, lower a large amount of over-testing, because oftentimes the issue is they don't know what tests have been run, or they don't trust that laboratory's results, and they need access to the raw data, the raw tests. The second opportunity here is the one that I want to spend the most time on, and it says data market. Health data is the most valuable data in the world. It's not even close. In the last 3 years, 25% of every security breach was for your healthcare data. So one insurance company in America, Cigna, off the top of my head, had to pay about $3,000 out of pocket per person for every single security breach. And this ended up being hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Another big issue that came up last year was 23andMe. Has anybody here ever heard of 23andMe? One guy, all right. So it's a really neat company. You can do a swab in your mouth, send your DNA or your saliva sample, and they'll tell you more about you. So going back to, thank you, Dick Cheney. Going back to, here. Going back to your genome, what are you made of? Where do you come from? And what was shown was that with a very uncurated amount of data, the company 23andMe was able to go to multinational pharma companies and sell your data. They sold it for $300 million. And this was just one small data set of which they could have created hundreds. Okay? So the healthcare companies that collect your data understand the value of it. The hospitals that are trying to parse it apart also understand this. The data market that has already been created allows the individual patient to own their data. It's a bit of a radical idea, but it's relatively simple. If you have a digital wallet that holds your digital assets, it's really just holding bits of information, isn't it? Money at the end of the day on the internet is just ones and zeros. Your health data is the same. As was said earlier, I believe, by Michael, it's literally just commoditizing most things, being able to put them on the blockchain. And there's a company based out of Boston by a very, very famous professor named George Church. The company is named Vertex, I believe. And they have already helped individuals take their data from 23andMe, put it on their markets, and be able to then license it out. So think of the implications for this. If you were able to get a test done, you get paid to do this test, the company can come back and tell you, your family history has these specific issues. These may be things that you want to keep an eye out for. Also, there is a company in another part of the world that's looking for patients with a similar issue. We're going to be able to put you in touch with similar people with similar concerns. And we're going to pay you $50,000 if you will willingly grant us access to this basic information. And it's a win-win-win across the boards. This helps the individual customers be able to afford their health care. This helps pharma companies and what are called CROs finds the patients for these earlier, remembering that most trials fail because they can't find the patients. And it also helps the regulators because now there's transparency. This is why blockchain is important, because if you put all of this on a anonymous but public ledger, then you can see who had access to what information, what drug came from where, and any of these quality assurance, quality control issues are pretty transparent. Which leads into the third opportunity here for clinical trials. People have been trying for the last 10 years to do what's called a digital multi-center clinical trial. So, for instance, a pharma company sitting here in Pakistan doing clinical trials without patients being here, doing clinical trials all around the world, literally just having them send data in. This would make their lives so much easier. Most pharma companies have to contract out all of the data analysis, all of the patient finding, and there's huge biases. If you are a doctor in a big hospital in most parts of the world, then pharma companies or researchers come to you and say, we want to do this trial here. We're going to pay your department this amount of money, and you're going to be responsible for finding this type of patients. And having spoken with both my father and the medical community in America as well as in China, what this really means is the only thing that you can offer as that researcher, that doctor in that hospital, is the patients that you currently have. You don't have access to this bigger pool. So let's say that you had somebody who would be a good fit, but they haven't come in for treatment or they haven't checked up in 6 to 12 months. You're no longer able to do much with them. The fourth here is for medical tracking. And again, off the top of my head, Pakistan is a very large producer of drugs in the world, as is China. Every 6 months, China has $600 million or more worth of counterfeit goods collected and then tested. And oftentimes it's found that they have massive issues. There was a $3 billion TCM and vitamin and supplement shipment from Shanghai into Australia. And they had to seize all of it because when they started anonymously testing it, they found that 90% of what they tested had rat poison in it. So I don't like my vitamins and supplements and my TCM treatments to have these issues. Medical tracking allows you to go from the very beginning, the API, the raw data, the raw material rather, of which Pakistan is one of the largest producers in the world, to be able to figure out where the drug was produced, how clean it was created, and therefore allowing import, export, and these sorts of tests that need to be done much more efficiently. You don't have to go and test everything if you know every single test that's been done along the way to verify this particular SKU. And the last but not least is insurance. And this was my photo selection because as an American living overseas, getting the right healthcare insurance hasn't been easy. And I feel personally like insurance a lot of times is just a Band-Aid, right? We're treating disease. We're not trying to get at the root cause of the issue. And that's ultimately what I believe healthcare is all about, is trying to, if you can treat, if you can diagnose early, do that. But the goal should be wellness and prevention. And I believe that's where insurance is ultimately moving, is to try and be more preventative. And so I know that this is what our other distinguished speaker will talk more about, but very quickly, insurance, my understanding is that they're trying to make a bigger push into chronic disease and trying to incentivize patients to do more. So again, in the US, in Singapore, 50% of the entire country's population is going to be paid to wear a Fitbit. Now, it might not seem like much, but if you go back to that Pioneer 100 photo, here. A large amount of the data that is used in clinical trials today is what's called RWE. Here it's called lifestyle, which is a fancy way of saying, for a long time, there was a qualitative understanding. If you exercise more, it's good for you. But trying to move to a place where we can say, if you get above, for your age category, your weight category, your risk category, a certain number of steps, we're willing to cover these things. We're willing to give you a break on how much you need to pay, okay? So these are 5 very large applications. So thank you guys so much for your patience. And I'd love it to just pause here. If you guys have any questions, I would love to get some feedback from the audience. So first, thank you very much.
Incidentally, I happen to be an information security specialist, and you have mentioned that blockchain will solve the data security issues.
Yes.
Just to give you an example, that in 2016, Ethereum was launched in May, and in the very next month, in June 2016, Ethereum was hacked. Mm-hmm. So, and Ethereum is based on blockchain, and blockchain is based on cryptography, and cryptography is based on mathematics. So what I'm...
Sorry, you're going to have to go slower. There's a lot of feedback from where I'm sitting.
Okay. What I'm saying that myself, I'm an information security specialist, mm-hmm. and you have mentioned that blockchain is going to solve some data security issues. And to give an example, in 2016, in the month of May, mm-hmm. Ethereum was launched first time. And in the very next month, in June, it is reported in the New York Times that it was hacked. Mm-hmm. So, and Ethereum is based on blockchain. Mm-hmm. Blockchain is based on cryptography, and cryptography is based on mathematics. So what I'm trying to say is that how can a blockchain-based healthcare solution is going to save those lives who are wearing those gadgets into their bodies?
Right. So I think there are two questions involved. Thank you. I think there are two questions here.
It's not exactly any question. I'm just giving some comments, and if you can shed some light on this comment.
So, if you go to CoinMarketTelegraph and various crypto-focused news media outlets, you'll read about some crypto security issue every week. If you really want to torture yourself, you can find it every day. So I'm not going to preach and say that it is the panacea. What I will say is that very specific layers for data security could have been taken for the two particular examples that were given. Those are pretty low-hanging fruits in terms of data security and access security. So I agree. Again, I default to the experts. I'm not a cryptography expert. For a project that my company is building, we do have a cryptography expert. He has his PhD from MIT and has been working, had previously worked for the DoD in cybersecurity for about 15 years. There are solutions. I'm not the technical expert to walk you through it step by step, but essentially, I think this is a new way of reimagining the way that we can start to look at creating data security solutions. But thank you. It's a great question.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please give Mr. Corley, the co-founder and CEO of DHB Global, the biggest round of applause.